In this video, we're going to talk about the imaginary unit and introduce its definition, and then we're going to use the definition to simplify a square root that contains a -1 as a factor. So the imaginary unit is the number whose square is -1, and we know in our real number system that if we square, let's just say we square -2, and when we square a negative number, it's multiplying it twice. A negative times a negative is a positive. If we square +2, 2 times 2 is 4. So regardless of whether we square a negative number or a positive number, we always get a positive answer. Therefore, if we're squaring a number and we get a negative number, a -1, that cannot be a number in our real number system. I is part of our complex number system and is a pure imaginary number, okay? And we'll get to our complex number system in our next video. So to simplify a square root that contains -1 as a factor, let's talk about that. All right, earlier in this chapter, we had talked about taking the square root or an even root of a number that was negative. And we said that the answer was not a real number. It's not a real number because it's a complex number or an imaginary number. And we'll actually get to the definition of a complex number in the next video. But when you take the square root of -4, it is a pure imaginary number. So let's work through some examples using the definition that, and this is the important part that you have to remember, I equals the square root of -1. Whenever we have a factor of -1 under a square root, we can replace it with I outside of the square root. So let's do a couple of examples. All right, these first 3 examples are very similar to the examples you have or the problems you have on your worksheet. So let's go ahead and work through these examples. Well, I have a negative under my radical, so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to write -1 times 4. So I'm going to factor out that -1 for my number, and then I'm going to take a look at my number and factor my number. I know that 4 is 2 times 2, and I have a nice group of 2 here, so I'm going to bring that group out. And I am left with 2 times the square root of -1. Well, just above, we had stated that I is the same thing as the square root of -1. That's the definition. So here's my square root of -1. I am going to replace that with I. And this is my final answer. This is a pure imaginary number. So now let's do my next example. I have the square root of -25. So I'm going to work this one in the same exact way. I'm going to factor out that -1, and then I'm going to factor my number. And I know that 25 is 5 times 5. And I know with square roots that I'm looking for groups of 2 of the same number. So I have a group of 5s, a pair of 5s. So when I am finished, my answer looks like this. And then I notice I have the square root of -1, which I can replace with I. And that's how you reduce a radical with a negative underneath it. And one more time, we're going to go through this. Okay, so I have a negative under my radical, so I'm going to factor it out. And then I'm going to factor my number 121, which I know is 11 times 11. I'm looking for groups of 2, so I'm going to bring one of my 11s out. And I can cross this group off. So I have 11 times the square root of -1. And then I notice I have the square root of -1, so this can still be simplified to 11i. All right, so what happens if your square root doesn't simplify all the way? How do you do it with a number that isn't a perfect square? Because these first three examples were all perfect squares. So let's work an example that's going to be similar to the problems you have on your worksheet, numbers 5 through 7. All right, so we're going to do the same thing. We're going to start off by factoring out that -1, and then we're going to factor our number 72. And I know that 72 is 2 times 36. And I know that 36 is 2 times 18. And I know that 18 is 2 times 9. And I know that 9 is 3 times 3. So this is a square root. I'm going to circle groups of 2 of the same numbers. So I get to take a 2 out, and I get to take a 3 out. And I'll cross those off, and I multiply them to get 6 square root, and this is where it's a little bit different. I'm going to separate the -1 from any other number that's under my radical. So I'm going to say 6 times the square root of -1 times the square root of 2. And now you can see that I have the square root of -1. So I'm going to simplify that to 6i times the square root of 2 for my final answer. So to take your I out, like to take the square root of -1 out, you don't really need to have a perfect square under there. You work it just like any other radical. Okay, so let's do another example that's not a perfect square. So this is the square root of -150, so I'm going to factor my negative out. And then I know that 2 goes into 150 75 times. Oops. Let's not forget to write our -1. -1 times 2 times 75. I know that 25 goes into 75 3 times. And I know that 25 is 5 times 5. So now I'm going to circle my groups of 2. And I'm going to take a 5 out. All right, so I am going to write this in the same fashion that I did before. I'm going to put my -1 under a radical by itself, and then I'm going to multiply these two numbers that remain. So I have the square root of 6. And I notice that I have the square root of -1 here, so I'm going to simplify further to get 5i square root of 6. And now I'm finished with this problem. And this is the last example we're going to go through. So I'm going to factor that -1 out. And then I'm going to factor 810, which is... Well, I'm going to make it a little easy. I know since it ends in a 0, right? Since it ends in a 0, one of the factors of this is 10. So it's going to be 10 times 81. And 10 is just 2 times 5. And 81 is 9 times 9. And I know I can keep factoring the 9s, but I already have a group of 2 numbers that are the same, so I don't really need to factor them anymore. So I'm going to take this group of 9s out, and when I'm done, I get 9 times the square root of -1. Remember, we're going to separate that, times, what is 2 times 5? It is 10. And then I am going to replace the square root of -1 with an I. Okay, so we've completed all the examples that I have in this video. You can go ahead and do your worksheet and do it the way that I did it on the video.